My brother shoved me out of my wheelchair in front of his fiancée's entire high society family. I crashed onto the hard marble floor surrounded by shattered crystal and spilled champagne. As I lay there, humiliated and completely helpless, he leaned down and hissed a cruel command through his teeth. "Get up, you cripple, and stop ruining my engagement." My own parents rushed over, but they did not come to help me. Instead, they frantically apologized to his wealthy new in-laws for my clumsiness. Everyone in that opulent country club ballroom expected me to crawl away ashamed. They thought they had finally broken me, but I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the one medical file my brother thought he had destroyed forever. And then his horrific lie was exposed to the world. My name is Chloe. I am 29 years old and I work as a medical coder for a massive healthcare network here in the United States. For the past 2 years, my entire world has been confined to the seat of a wheelchair. 2 years of looking up at people. 2 years of navigating a society that suddenly feels too fast, too steep, and too impatient for someone who cannot walk. But I adapted. I had to. I learned to be quiet. I learned to take up as little space as possible. That was exactly how my family wanted me. Invisible, especially tonight. Tonight was supposed to be the absolute pinnacle of my older brother Julian's existence. We were at the Oak Ridge Country Club, the kind of place where the chandeliers dripped with imported crystal, the waitstaff wore white gloves, and the floral arrangements on a single table cost more than my entire month's rent. Julian was celebrating his engagement to Abigail Kensington. The Kensingtons were old money real estate royalty who practically owned half the commercial property in our state. Abigail was standing near the grand staircase wearing a custom silk gown and a diamond ring that caught the light from every conceivable angle. Her father, Richard Kensington, was holding court by the private bar surrounded by eager investors, local politicians, and sycophants hoping for a crumb of his wealth. And right in the middle of it all was Julian. He was playing the role of the perfect son, the brilliant young financial analyst, the golden boy who was about to marry into a massive empire. My parents, Robert and Susan, were floating through the crowd, practically vibrating with pride. They wore expensive clothes they could not really afford, sipping vintage champagne and bragging to anyone who would listen about their incredible son. I was supposed to stay in the background. My mother had explicitly told me to park my wheelchair near the service doors before the guests arrived. She said she did not want me getting in the way of the professional photographers. She said it was Julian's night and I needed to be considerate. So I sat in the shadows, watching my family perform their perfect lives. But after an hour of sitting by the swinging kitchen doors, I was terribly thirsty. No waiter had looked down long enough to notice me, their eyes fixed firmly on the wealthy guests standing tall in the center of the room. I decided to wheel myself toward the beverage station. Navigating a crowded ballroom in a wheelchair is an exhausting, terrifying puzzle. You have to anticipate everyone's movements. People stepping backward without looking, people gesturing wildly with heavy drinks, people who simply do not register your existence below their eye level. I was halfway across the room, carefully dodging silk dresses and tailored suits, when I realized I was on a direct collision course with Julian. He was walking backward, laughing loudly at a joke Richard Kensington had just made, holding a freshly poured flute of champagne. I tried to stop. I gripped the metal hand rims of my wheels with all my strength, but my tires caught the thick, raised edge of an expensive decorative rug. The chair jerked unexpectedly. I lurched forward, losing my balance, and my elbow clipped a passing waiter's silver tray. A single champagne flute toppled off the edge. It shattered against the polished marble floor, sending shards of glass flying right at Julian's expensive leather shoes. The sharp sound of breaking glass cut through the soft jazz music playing in the background. Julian spun around. For a fraction of a second, I saw his carefully constructed mask completely slip. He did not see his sister. He saw an embarrassment. He saw a blemish on his flawless evening. He saw a threat to his perfect image in front of the Kensington family. Without thinking, without a single ounce of hesitation or brotherly concern, Julian planted his hand firmly against the armrest of my wheelchair and shoved me. He did not just push me aside to protect his suit. He shoved me with the full, vicious force of his anger. The rubber wheels skidded violently on the slick marble. The heavy chair tipped backward. The world tilted upside down in a terrifying blur, and I crashed hard onto the cold stone floor. Pain radiated through my bad shoulder and shot up my spine. The air rushed out of my lungs in a sharp gasp. I lay there, completely paralyzed, staring up at the blinding crystal chandeliers. The jazz music stopped abruptly. The chatter died instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entire ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned to look at the spectacle. My brother, the golden boy, standing over his disabled sister, who was sprawled helplessly among broken glass and spilled champagne. I waited for him to gasp. I waited for him to reach down to pull me up to play the protective hero he always pretended to be in front of audiences. Ever since my accident, Julian loved telling people how much he sacrificed to help his disabled sister. I waited for that fake sympathy. Instead, Julian knelt beside me. He leaned in very close, so close I could smell the sharp, expensive cologne he wore. His face was twisted with absolute rage. He whispered, his voice a venomous, quiet hiss meant only for my ears. "Get up, you cripple, and stop ruining my engagement." The cruelty of those words hit me harder than the marble floor had. Before I could even process the absolute shock, I heard frantic footsteps rushing toward us. My parents, my mother Susan and my father Robert. Finally, I thought. Finally, they would see what he truly was. Finally, they would help me. But they did not kneel beside me. They did not ask if I was hurt or bleeding. My mother stepped right over my legs, turning her back to me completely, and rushed straight to Abigail and Richard Kensington. "Oh my goodness, we are so terribly sorry," my mother gushed, her voice practically trembling with panic. "Chloe is just so clumsy sometimes. The wheelchair makes her so uncoordinated. Please forgive this disruption. We will get her out of your way immediately." My father chimed in, patting Richard Kensington's shoulder with a nervous laugh. "Just a little accident. Julian is always so patient with her, but she really should have stayed in her corner. We sincerely apologize for the mess." I lay there on the cold floor listening to my own parents apologize for my existence. They were sacrificing my dignity to protect Julian's lie. They were treating me like a broken piece of furniture that had ruined their perfect aesthetic. Everyone in that room stared down at me with pity and disgust. They expected me to cry. They expected me to drag my useless legs back into my chair, hide my face, and wheel myself out the back door in absolute shame. The old Chloe would have done exactly that. The old Chloe would have swallowed the humiliation to keep the peace, because for my entire life, I had been the one expected to sacrifice everything for Julian. When we were younger, my college savings were drained to pay for his private tutoring. When I started working, I handed over my paychecks to help cover his massive credit card debt so he could maintain his wealthy lifestyle. I had given up my own future so he could build his. And when the accident happened 2 years ago, when a horrific car crash shattered my spine and left me permanently paralyzed, Julian had played the hero. He told everyone he had bravely pulled me from the wreckage of a hit and run. My parents had wept and called him a saint. They demanded that I spend the rest of my life thanking him for my survival. But the old Chloe had died 2 years ago. As I lay on the floor of that country club listening to my mother beg for forgiveness from strangers, I did not cry. A cold, absolute calm washed over me, starting from my chest and spreading all the way down to my motionless toes. My career as a medical coder taught me one very important lesson. Numbers never lie, and hospital records hold every secret a person tries to bury. I reached out and grabbed the sturdy carved wooden leg of the Kensington's reserved dinner table. My upper body strength had grown immense over the last 2 years of pushing my own weight. I hauled myself up, ignoring the burning pain in my shoulder, and pulled my body onto the nearest empty dining chair. I sat upright directly at eye level with the people who had just thrown me away. Julian sneered at me. "I told you to get out," he muttered, gesturing frantically for the country club security to come and remove me. I ignored him entirely. I reached down into the thick canvas medical bag strapped to the back of my fallen wheelchair. My fingers wrapped around a heavy, overstuffed manila folder. I pulled it out. The folder weighed almost 3 pounds, filled with hundreds of pages, and it was stamped with a bright red warning across the front that read "Confidential Hospital Records." I looked at Julian. The arrogant sneer on his face faltered for just a second as his eyes locked onto the red stamp. I looked at my parents, who had stopped their groveling and were suddenly staring at the folder with wide, terrified eyes. And then I looked directly at Richard Kensington, the billionaire patriarch who was about to welcome my brother into his family. I lifted the file high and slammed it down onto the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The crack of the heavy folder hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. Everyone jumped. "Julian," I said, my voice completely steady and carrying clearly across the quiet room. "You have spent the last 2 years telling everyone how you heroically saved me from a hit and run. You told Abigail how traumatized you were by the crash. You told my parents how hard you worked to pull me from the wreckage." Julian took a step forward, his face draining of color. "Chloe, shut your mouth right now. You're having a mental episode." I did not stop. But you see, as a medical coder, I have access to things regular people do not understand. I know how to request archived trauma files. I know how to read paramedic intake reports. And I know how to find the suppressed toxicology screens that mysteriously vanished from the police report. My mother let out a small, horrified gasp. "Robert, do something," she whispered frantically to my father. I tapped my finger on the thick file. The paramedic report in this folder paints a very different picture of that night. It states clearly that when they arrived on the scene, my body was draped across the steering wheel, but the seatbelt bruising on my chest was on the passenger side. And the blood on the driver's side airbag was a perfect genetic match to you, Julian. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Abigail Kensington covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes darting between me and her fiancé. "You were not the hero who saved me, Julian." I kept my voice loud enough for every single wealthy investor to hear. "You were the drunk driver who crashed the car. You were so terrified of getting a felony conviction that would ruin your finance career that you dragged your own unconscious bleeding sister into the driver's seat to take the blame. You broke my spine, Julian, and you have spent the last 2 years letting me thank you for it." The silence that followed my words was absolute and suffocating. In a ballroom filled with hundreds of wealthy guests, the only sound was the soft clinking of ice melting in unattended cocktail glasses. Julian stood frozen, his perfectly tailored tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume that did not quite fit. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked frantically at his fiancée Abigail, whose wide, terrified eyes were locked onto the thick medical file sitting on the pristine white tablecloth. "Abigail," Julian stammered, his voice cracking as he reached out a trembling hand toward her. "Abigail, you have to know she's not well. Ever since the accident, Chloe has had these terrible delusions. The doctors warned us about this. It is a traumatic brain injury. She's having a psychotic break right now in front of everyone." My mother, Susan, immediately lunged forward, her expensive silk evening gown rustling loudly as she tried to snatch the heavy manila folder off the table. "Please, Richard," she pleaded, turning her frantic, tear-filled eyes toward Abigail's father. "Our daughter is deeply disturbed. The paralysis, the trauma, it has broken her mind. We have been trying to get her psychiatric help for 2 years. This is just a horrific, tragic outburst. We will take her home immediately." I slammed my hand down on top of the file before my mother's manicured fingers could grab it. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer force of my conviction made my mother flinch and pull her hand back. "I am not disturbed," I said, staring directly into my mother's eyes, until she was forced to look away. "And I am not leaving." I turned my gaze back to Julian, who was practically sweating through his expensive collar. "For 2 agonizing years, I have sat quietly in my wheelchair and listened to you build an entire persona out of my tragedy." I addressed the silent crowd, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Everyone in this room has heard his favorite story, have you not? The story Julian loves to tell at country club dinners, at holiday parties, and probably on his very first date with Abigail. The tragic tale of the phantom black truck that supposedly ran us off a slick winding road late at night. He paints such a vivid, heroic picture. He tells everyone how the car rolled into a ravine, how he miraculously crawled out of the wreckage with nothing but a mild concussion and a scratch on his forehead. And then comes the part where he plays the ultimate savior. He tells you how he bravely reached into the crushed metal of the driver's seat, risking his own life to pull his little sister from the smoking ruins before the car caught fire. Several guests in the front row awkwardly shifted their weight, their eyes darting to the floor. They knew the story. Julian had milked it for every ounce of sympathy and admiration he could gather from the local elite. My father, Robert, stepped forward, his face flushed dark red with anger and embarrassment. "Chloe, that is enough," he ordered, using the harsh, booming voice he always used to intimidate me when I was a child. You are humiliating yourself. Julian saved your life. You owe him everything. You owe this entire family your gratitude. I owe him nothing, I shot back, the words tearing out of my throat. And I owed this family nothing. But that did not stop you from taking every single thing I had to give. I looked at Abigail, whose hands were trembling as she clutched her expensive silk shawl. You think you are marrying a self-made, responsible man, Abigail? You think he built his own success. But you do not know the real Julian. And you certainly do not know what I sacrificed to put him in this room tonight. Before the crash ever happened, before I lost the use of my legs, I spent the entirety of my early 20s working myself to the bone for his benefit. When I was 22, Julian got accepted into a highly prestigious, obscenely expensive business school. He had completely maxed out his credit cards on luxury vacations and expensive clothes to keep up with his wealthy friends. He had no way to pay the tuition. My parents sat me down at our battered kitchen table. They told me that Julian was the brilliant one. Julian was the family's best investment. My father looked me in the eye and said, "Family comes first, Chloe. We all have to pitch in for your brother's future. You are a hard worker. You can pick up the slack." So I did. I believed them because I was young, foolish, and desperate for my parents' approval. I took a grueling job as a medical coder at a massive hospital network. I worked 60-hour weeks, staring at glowing computer screens until my vision blurred and my head throbbed with blinding migraines. I lived in a tiny, terrible apartment and ate cheap noodles just so I could hand over every single spare dollar I earned to pay down my brother's $80,000 student debt. I funded the very degree that allowed him to walk into your wealthy social circles. I bought the suit he is wearing right now. I gave up my youth, my savings, and my own dreams because I was taught that my only value in this family was what I could provide for Julian. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a friendly face. But the crowd was captivated by the absolute horror of the truth. And then came the night of the crash. I continued, my voice trembling slightly as the memories flooded back. Julian had just landed his big promotion at the investment firm. He was celebrating at a high-end bar downtown. I was not there to celebrate. I was only there because he called me at 1 a.m. demanding that I come pick him up. When I arrived, he was completely blackout drunk. He could barely stand, but he absolutely refused to leave his brand new sports car in the parking lot. I begged him to let me drive. I pleaded with him, but Julian has never liked taking orders from the sister he viewed as a personal servant. He ripped the keys out of my hand, shoved me into the passenger seat, and got behind the wheel. "That is a lie!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Abigail, do not listen to her. She was driving. The police report said she was driving." I smiled, but there was no joy in it. It was the cold, hollow smile of someone who had spent 2 years piecing together a monstrous betrayal. I placed my hand on the red confidential stamp of the medical file. The police report said I was driving because the local police only documented what they found. When they arrived on the scene, I explained carefully, making sure Richard Kensington heard every single word. But my parents forgot what I do for a living. I am a medical coder. My entire profession involves reading the detailed, uncensored notes that doctors, nurses, and paramedics leave in secure digital archives. Notes that families never see. Notes that get buried in bureaucratic red tape. I know how to navigate the system. I know the legal channels to request my own full unredacted hospital records from the state archives. I flipped open the thick manila folder. The sound of the heavy paper turning echoed in the dead silent room. I pulled out a highlighted page and held it up. Mananto and G. This is the original intake report written by the first responding paramedic. I said, reading the crisp black text. It clearly states, patient found unconscious in the driver's seat, but exhibits severe blunt force trauma and seatbelt contusions consistent with a passenger side impact. The steering wheel airbag deployed, but the blood spatter on the driver's side fabric does not match the unconscious patient's blood type. My mother let out a small strangled sob and buried her face in her hands. My father stared at the floor, his entire body rigid with terror. I pulled out a second sheet of paper, this one bearing the official logo of the Regional Trauma Center. And this, I announced, my voice, ringing with absolute undeniable clarity, is the suppressed toxicology report. When Julian was treated for his minor concussion, the hospital drew his blood. It is standard procedure. His blood alcohol level was 0.18, more than twice the legal limit. Abigail stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest as she stared at Julian in absolute disgust. I looked my brother dead in the eyes. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the agony I had lived with for 2 years. While I was unconscious, bleeding internally with my spine completely shattered from the impact of the tree you hit, you did not call for help. You did not try to save my life. You realized that a felony conviction for driving under the influence would instantly destroy your new corporate career. You realized you would lose your high society friends, your income, and your perfect reputation. So you made a choice. You reached across the center console of that ruined car, you unbuckled my limp, broken body, and you dragged your paralyzed sister across the glass-covered seats, shoving me behind the steering wheel. You placed the blame on me to save yourself. You let the police believe I was the one who lost control. You let the insurance companies blame me. You let me wake up in a hospital bed entirely unable to feel my legs, completely convinced that I had ruined my own life. And then you sat by my bedside, crying fake tears, holding my hand and telling me not to worry because you would always take care of me. Julian was shaking uncontrollably now. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Richard Kensington, hoping for an ounce of wealthy solidarity, but the billionaire patriarch was staring at him with an expression of cold, calculating fury. You shoved me out of my wheelchair tonight because you thought I was a pathetic, broken nuisance who was ruining your perfect aesthetic. I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, resonant whisper that filled the entire room. But I am not broken, Julian. I am the only reason you are not sitting in a federal prison right now, and tonight your illusion ends. Julian did not crumble. He did not fall to his knees and confess. Instead, he straightened his tailored jacket and looked at the crowd with an expression of profound manufactured pity. He shook his head slowly, letting out a heavy sigh that echoed through the silent ballroom. He turned to Richard Kensington and spoke in a voice dripping with fake sorrow. "I am so sorry you all had to see this," Julian said. "The doctors warned us this might happen. When Chloe hit her head in the crash, the traumatic brain injury altered her reality. She has these terrible paranoid delusions. She fabricates documents. She buys fake papers online. We have spent thousands trying to get her psychiatric help, but she just keeps getting worse." I stared at him in absolute disbelief. He was gaslighting me in front of hundreds of people. He was using my trauma, the very trauma he caused, to paint me as a lunatic. My parents did not miss a beat. They saw their golden boy's future flashing before their eyes, and they immediately jumped in to protect their investment. My father, Robert, signaled the country club security guards standing near the grand doors. "Grab her wheelchair," my father ordered the guards, his voice booming with forced authority. "She is having a severe mental breakdown. She's a danger to herself and others. Get her out of this club immediately." 2 large men in dark suits marched toward me. I tried to speak. I tried to tell the Kensingtons to look at the hospital seals on the papers, to look at the dates. But the guards grabbed the handles of my wheelchair. They yanked me backward so violently, my neck snapped back. My mother, Susan, walked right up to me as the guards began to roll me away. She leaned down, her face twisted with a vicious, quiet hatred I had never seen before. "You are sick, Chloe," my mother whispered coldly. "You are a bitter, jealous cripple who cannot stand to see your brother happy. Do not ever contact us again. You are no longer my daughter." They wheeled me backward through the grand ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy guests stared at me. Some looked sympathetic, but most looked deeply uncomfortable, turning their faces away as if my disability and my alleged insanity were contagious diseases. The heavy wooden doors of the country club slammed shut in my face, cutting off the warmth and the soft music, leaving me completely alone in the damp, freezing parking lot. I had just been discarded. Again. The journey back to my apartment was a blur of physical pain and total numbness. I had to wait 45 minutes in the cold rain for an accessible transit van. When I finally reached my building, the contrast to the country club could not have been more sickening. I lived in a cramped, poorly lit complex on the industrial side of town. The elevator was broken half the time, and the narrow hallway smelled of old cooking oil and damp carpet. My apartment was technically compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it was nothing more than a bleak concrete box. The doorways were barely wide enough for my chair. The kitchen counters were too high, forcing me to stretch painfully just to pour a glass of water. I parked my wheelchair in the center of the dark living room. My shoulder throbbed relentlessly from where Julian had shoved me onto the marble floor. I sat there in the silence listening to the rain hit the cheap single-pane windows. I expected to break down. I expected to cry until my lungs burned. I had just lost my parents, my brother, and my entire extended family in one single evening. But the tears never came. Instead, a slow burning heat began to rise in my chest. Heartbreak morphed into absolute concentrated rage. I replayed the scene at the country club over and over in my mind. Something about Julian's reaction bothered me. He was panicked at first, yes, but the moment he realized I only had the medical files, he regained his composure far too quickly. He was too confident. He acted like a man who knew the worst was still hidden. If Julian was capable of dragging my bleeding body across the front seat of a crushed car to avoid a drunk driving charge, what else was he capable of doing? My parents had happily ruined my reputation to protect his corporate career. They had bribed a local investigator and taken out a second mortgage to cover his tracks. But bribery is expensive. Bribing a public official costs tens of thousands of dollars, and my parents were practically drowning in debt before the crash. Julian had just graduated and had no real savings. Where did they get the money? And how was Julian suddenly affording a luxury sports car and a custom diamond engagement ring on a junior analyst salary? The questions circled in my mind like vultures. I wheeled myself over to my small desk in the corner of the room. I flipped open my laptop. The blue light illuminated the dark room. I am a professional medical coder. My entire job revolves around tracking billing cycles, understanding insurance payouts, and finding the hidden numbers in complex healthcare systems. I had never bothered to investigate my own insurance payouts after the crash. My parents had handled all the paperwork while I was fighting for my life in the intensive care unit. They told me the insurance company refused to pay a large settlement because the police report ruled the crash an unavoidable accident with an unidentified driver. They told me the meager payouts barely covered my hospital bills, which was why I had to live in this terrible cheap apartment. I cracked my knuckles. I logged into the central healthcare and insurance database using my secure credentials. I was going to find out exactly how much my broken spine was really worth. The process was tedious. It required bypassing several administrative walls and cross-referencing my social security number with regional insurance claim registries. But I knew exactly where to look. I navigated through the digital labyrinth of the state's auto and health insurance portals. I pulled up the primary incident date, 2 years ago, October 14th. The screen loaded. The digital file for my bodily injury claim appeared. My heart slammed against my ribs as my eyes scanned the lines of data. There was no denial letter. There was no rejected claim. The insurance company had not fought the payout at all. Because my injuries were catastrophic and resulted in permanent paralysis from the waist down, the claim was expedited. I scrolled down to the final settlement figure, $2.5 million. I stared at the number on the screen. The zeros blurred together. $2.5 million. The money was intended to cover a lifetime of physical therapy, a custom accessible home-specialized medical equipment, and daily living assistance. It was money meant to give me dignity. It was money meant to give me a life. I looked around my dingy, dark apartment. I looked at my bruised shoulder and my cheap manual wheelchair that constantly jammed on the uneven floors. The money had been paid out in full 18 months ago, but I had never seen a single cent. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I had to follow the money. I accessed the disbursement routing numbers attached to the insurance claim. The $2.5 million had not been deposited into a secure trust in my name. It had been wired to an external holding account. I ran a corporate registry search on the routing number. The account belonged to a limited liability company called Apex Holdings. I dug deeper. I searched the state business registry for Apex Holdings. The formation documents loaded onto my screen. The sole managing director of the company was Julian. He stole it. He stole all of it. But how? A settlement of that magnitude for a catastrophic injury cannot just be handed over to a sibling without extreme legal oversight. The insurance company would require a direct signature from the beneficiary, unless the beneficiary was legally incapacitated. I opened a new tab and searched the county court probate and guardianship records. I typed in my own name. The search results yielded exactly one document: a temporary medical and financial guardianship order granted to Julian with my parents listed as primary supporting witnesses. I pulled up the scanned document. There at the bottom of the page was my signature. It was a shaky, barely legible, trailing off the signature line, like the scratching of a frightened child. But it was definitely my handwriting. My breath caught in my throat as the memory slammed into my mind. I was in the intensive care unit. It was maybe 4 days after the crash. I was drowning in a sea of heavy narcotics and blinding pain. I could not feel my legs. I was terrified. My mother and father had stood on either side of my hospital bed. Julian was standing at the foot of the bed crying and telling me everything was going to be fine. My father had placed a pen in my trembling hand. My mother had physically guided my fingers over a stack of thick legal papers. They told me the hospital needed authorization to perform emergency spinal surgery. They told me I had to sign the papers or the doctors would let me die. They lied. There were no surgery authorization forms. While I was lying in a hospital bed, heavily medicated and completely paralyzed, my own family had orchestrated a legal coup. They forced me to sign away my financial rights, granting Julian absolute control over my life and my assets. I sat in my dark apartment, shaking with a kind of anger that transcended simple rage. This was pure, unadulterated evil. I went back to the financial routing data. I started tracking the outgoing transfers from Julian's shell company. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Exactly 2 weeks after the $2.5 million hit the holding account, there was a massive wire transfer to a private banking institution. The exact amount matched the payoff of my parents' second mortgage and the hefty bribe paid to the corrupt crash investigator. My parents had sold their daughter out, and Julian had paid them off with my own money. I tracked the next transfer, $85,000 wired to a luxury car dealership in the city. The exact dealership where Julian purchased his shiny new sports car. He was literally driving around on the value of my lost legs. And then came the final sickening discovery. Just 3 months ago, Julian had wired $120,000 to an exclusive high-end jeweler in New York. The timeline matched perfectly. It was the exact week he proposed to Abigail Kensington. I thought about the massive 4-carat diamond ring glittering on Abigail's finger at the country club. I thought about Julian standing on that stage, soaking in the admiration of the wealthy elite, pretending to be a brilliant financial success. His entire life, his engagement, his car, his reputation, his freedom from prison. Every single piece of his perfect existence was built on a foundation of my stolen blood and bone. They had taken my ability to walk. They had taken my youth. They had taken my parents' love. And then they had taken my future to fund their luxury. They thought I was weak. They thought because my legs did not work, I would never be able to stand up to them. They thought I would stay quiet and rot away in this terrible apartment until I simply faded out of existence. They were wrong. I reached for my phone and opened my contact list. I was not going to cry anymore. I was going to tear their entire world down to the studs. I was going to make sure that by the time I was finished, Julian would have absolutely nothing left, and my parents would experience exactly what it felt like to be discarded and left with nothing. I sat in the dark living room of my cramped apartment with the glowing screen of my laptop, illuminating the peeling wallpaper. The digital evidence of Julian's massive financial theft was staring me right in the face. I had found the holding companies. I had traced the routing numbers. I knew he had stolen my $2.5 million settlement. But digital trails can be contested by expensive defense lawyers. Julian would undoubtedly claim his accounts were hacked or that the records were fabricated by a jealous sister. I knew that if I was going to destroy him, I needed the original documents. I needed the paper trail with the physical ink signatures. I thought about where a man like Julian would keep the physical proof of a multi-million-dollar fraud. He would not keep it at his luxury downtown condo where his new wealthy fiancée or her nosy family might stumble across it. Julian was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He would keep his deepest secrets in the one place he felt absolutely untouchable. He would keep them in the fortress of my parents' suburban home. Julian had lived with them for 6 months after the crash, while he was supposedly saving money for his own place. My father, Robert, kept everything important locked away in his meticulously organized home office. I knew their schedule perfectly. The entire family was completely obsessed with the upcoming wedding. Today was Tuesday. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my parents and Julian had a highly anticipated wedding cake tasting appointment with Abigail and her parents at an exclusive artisanal bakery in the city center. Susan had been bragging about this tasting on social media for weeks, going on and on about imported vanilla beans and spun sugar decorations. They were completely preoccupied with their performance of high society wealth. I knew they would be gone for at least 3 hours. The drive to my parents' neighborhood took 45 minutes. I parked my modified accessible van a block away just in case a nosy neighbor was watching from their front window. I lowered the mechanical ramp and wheeled myself down onto the damp pavement. Every push of my wheel sent a jolt of pain through my bruised shoulder from where Julian had shoved me the night before. I ignored it. I pushed myself up the street toward the house I had grown up in. The house stood tall and immaculate, a monument to suburban perfection. The lawn was perfectly manicured. The white paint was pristine. It looked exactly like the kind of home where good, honest, and loving people lived. It made me sick to my stomach. I navigated up the cheap aluminum ramp my father had hastily installed over the front steps when I briefly stayed there after my rehabilitation. They had complained about the cost of that ramp constantly until I finally moved out to escape their quiet resentment. I pulled my old brass key from my pocket. It slid into the lock perfectly. The door clicked open. The house smelled like expensive floral candles and citrus potpourri. It was silent and perfectly clean. I wheeled myself straight down the hallway toward my father's home office at the back of the house. The heavy oak door was closed but unlocked. I pushed it open and rolled inside. The room was exactly as my father always kept it, pompous and overly organized. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, surrounded by dark green leather chairs and tall bookshelves filled with biographies of wealthy businessmen he idolized. I started my search immediately. I went through the filing cabinets, opening heavy metal drawers and scanning the tabs. I found tax returns, utility bills, and old bank statements, but nothing related to Julian or my accident. I stopped and looked around the room. My father was a man who loved feeling powerful. He loved keeping things locked away. I rolled my chair toward the large walk-in closet in the corner of the office. I pushed the louvered doors open. Beneath a row of dry-cleaned winter coats sitting squarely on the floor was a heavy steel digital safe bolted directly to the hardwood planks. I stared at the glowing electronic keypad. I needed a 4-digit code. I thought about my father's intense ego and his absolute worship of his only son. My father had remarkably little imagination when it came to security. He used the same 4 digits for his home alarm system, his golf club locker, and his phone passcode. 0812, August 12th, Julian's birthday. He did not use his wedding anniversary. He certainly did not use my birthday. He used the date his golden child was born. I reached down and punched the numbers into the keypad. A green light flashed. The heavy steel bolts clicked open with a loud, satisfying thud. I pulled the heavy safe door open. Inside were stacks of thick manila envelopes. I reached in and grabbed the first one. It was labeled Julian Medical in my father's sharp slanted handwriting. I opened it and pulled out a small stack of papers. There they were, the original temporary medical and financial guardianship documents. I stared at the black ink. I traced my finger over my own signature at the bottom of the page. It was jagged and weak, trailing off the signature line like the scratching of a frightened child. It was the writing of a terrified young woman strapped to a hospital bed pumped full of morphine and fentanyl. I vividly remembered my mother holding my wrist, guiding the pen while whispering sweet lies into my ear. She had told me I needed to sign the forms so the doctors could perform emergency surgery to fix my spine. They had used my absolute vulnerability and my blind trust in my own mother to strip away my legal rights. I placed the guardianship papers on my lap and reached back into the safe. The next folder was much thicker. It was labeled Home Equity. I pulled out a stack of bank statements and loan origination documents. It was a second mortgage taken out on the family house for $150,000. The date on the bank approval documents was October 28th. That was exactly 2 weeks after the car crash. I frowned, staring at the date. Why would my parents leverage their pristine home for a massive amount of cash right after my accident? My medical bills were fully covered by the hospital's emergency charity program because I was young and had zero income. Julian had suffered nothing more than a minor concussion. There was absolutely no legitimate reason for my parents to need $150,000 in cash. I dug deeper into the safe and pulled out a small black leather notebook. My father was incredibly old-fashioned. He did not trust digital spreadsheets for his most sensitive matters. He liked to keep physical handwritten ledgers of his debts and his leverage over other people. I flipped open the leather cover. The pages were filled with columns of dates and dollar amounts. I scanned down the pages until I found the entries for late October 2 years ago. The entries were written in black ink. October 30th. Cash withdrawal, $50,000. Next to the massive amount, my father had written a single name, Detective Miller. The air rushed out of my lungs. I knew that name. Detective Miller was the lead traffic investigator assigned to my crash. He was the man who had walked into my hospital room while I was paralyzed and weeping. He was the man who stood at the foot of my bed wearing a cheap wrinkled suit and told me that because the roads were slick and there were no other witnesses, he had officially ruled that I was at fault for losing control of the vehicle. He had looked a terrified, paralyzed young woman directly in the eyes and told her that she had ruined her own life. And my father had paid him $50,000 in cash to do it. My hands began to shake so violently, the black notebook rattled against my knees. I forced myself to turn the page. November 2nd, cash withdrawal, $30,000. The note beside this amount read, hospital lab technician payoff, blood sample destroyed. November 5th, cash withdrawal, $20,000. The note read, tow truck operator silence fee. The sheer magnitude of the evil I was holding in my hands washed over me like freezing water. My lungs simply stopped working. The air in my father's beautiful cedar-lined office suddenly felt toxic and incredibly thin. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair so hard, my knuckles turned completely white. It was one thing to figure out that Julian had dragged my bleeding body across the front seat of that crushed car to save himself from a felony. Julian was an arrogant coward. Julian was a dangerous narcissist. I had always known that deep down in my gut. But my parents, my mother, and my father, they knew. They knew Julian was driving that car drunk. They knew Julian had caused the crash that snapped my spine in half. They knew he had dragged my broken body into the driver's seat and left me slumped over the steering wheel to take the blame. And instead of holding their son accountable, instead of protecting their daughter, whose life had just been violently, permanently destroyed, they held a quiet family meeting. They went to the bank. They mortgaged their home to buy the silence of the local police and the hospital staff. They bought Julian's freedom with my legs. I closed my eyes and a flood of agonizing memories rushed into my mind. I thought about the terrible weeks I spent in the inpatient rehabilitation center. I remembered crying myself to sleep every single night, crushed by the overwhelming, unbearable guilt of believing I had caused the accident. I remembered apologizing to my parents over and over again, through heavy sobs, begging them to forgive me for crashing the car and ruining our lives. I remembered my mother sitting by my bed, stroking my hair with a gentle hand. I remembered her looking at me with a soft, sad smile and telling me that God works in mysterious ways and that I just needed to accept my punishment and learn to be grateful I was still alive. She had watched me drown in absolute self-hatred. She had watched me beg for forgiveness for a crime I did not commit, knowing the entire time that I was completely innocent. They had willingly, intentionally sacrificed my physical mobility, my independence, and my mental sanity to protect their golden child from facing a prison sentence. They had looked at me, their own flesh and blood, and decided I was an acceptable casualty. I was nothing more than the sacrificial lamb placed on the altar of Julian's brilliant finance career. I did not scream. I did not throw the black leather ledger across the room. I did not cry a single tear. The blinding, helpless rage inside me rapidly crystallized into something cold, sharp, and absolutely terrifying. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and opened the camera. I began photographing every single page of the ledger. I photographed the second mortgage documents. I photographed the bank withdrawal receipts and the temporary guardianship papers. I made sure the overhead lighting was perfect. I made sure every single signature, every date, and every damning note my father had written was perfectly legible. I took dozens of pictures securing the evidence in multiple cloud storage accounts. Then I took the original black ledger, the forged guardianship papers, and the mortgage documents and shoved them deep to the bottom of my canvas bag. Let my father tear this beautiful office apart looking for them. Let him panic when he realized his vault of secrets was empty. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe and spun the dial. I closed the closet doors, making sure the dry-cleaned coats hung exactly as they had before. I wheeled my chair carefully backward over the plush carpet, smoothing out the tracks my wheels had made. I moved silently through the quiet house, taking one last look at the framed family photos in the hallway. Photos of Julian graduating, Julian playing sports, Julian smiling with our parents. There were no photos of me. I pulled the front door shut and locked it behind me. I rolled down the cheap aluminum ramp and used the mechanical lift to climb back into my transit van. As I put the key in the ignition, I looked at the pristine white house one last time. It was no longer a childhood home. It was a crime scene, and I was going to make absolutely certain that everyone involved paid for what they did. I had barely navigated my wheelchair back into the narrow, cramped hallway of my apartment when the loud pounding started. I had just secured the deadbolt and was still clutching the canvas bag containing my father's hidden ledger and the forged medical documents. The pounding was not a polite knock. It was the violent, aggressive hammering of someone who felt completely entitled to break down my door. Before I could even back my chair away, the deadbolt splintered. The cheap wooden doorframe cracked open with a sickening crunch. Julian stepped into my living room. He was not alone. Behind him were two massive, imposing men wearing dark-of-the-rack suits. They looked exactly like the kind of hired muscle wealthy people use when they want to handle a problem without leaving a paper trail. Julian was no longer playing the polished golden boy of the country club. His designer tie was pulled loose, and his face was flushed a dark, angry red. He looked frantic, like a cornered animal. He marched straight toward me, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You think you are so smart," he spat, his voice echoing off the thin walls of my apartment. "You think you can walk into my engagement party and make me look like a fool in front of the Kensington family? You think a few fake hospital printouts are going to ruin my life?" I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew I had to play the part of the terrified, paralyzed sister. I needed him to believe he still had the upper hand, so he would not realize I had just emptied his father's secret safe. "Julian, please," I said, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound completely defeated. I just wanted the truth out. "You stole my settlement. You left me with nothing." Julian let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He gestured to one of the large men standing by the broken doorframe. The man stepped forward, walked directly to my small dining table, and picked up my laptop. Without a single word, he raised it above his head and smashed it down onto the hard linoleum floor. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of cracked glass. He brought the heavy heel of his boot down on the casing, crushing the hard drive until the plastic snapped and bent. I gasped, shrinking back into my chair, but deep inside my chest, my heart was completely steady. They were destroying a cheap, outdated machine. I had already uploaded every single photograph of the forged guardianship papers, the bank transfers, and my father's bribery ledger to 3 separate secure cloud servers before I even drove back to my apartment. Julian was destroying empty plastic, but I let him think he was destroying my only evidence. "You listened to me very carefully," Julian said, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath mixed with the expensive cologne he bought with my money. "The Kensingtons are not like us, Chloe. They do not just have money. They have absolute power. Richard Kensington plays golf with the chief of police. He funds the campaigns of half the judges in this county. If you go to the cops with your pathetic little story, you will be the one who ends up locked away. They will have you committed to a psychiatric ward faster than you can blink. You'll be a crazy, crippled woman screaming about a conspiracy while I'm living in a mansion." He stood up straight, adjusting his cuffs with a sickening arrogance. "You are going to keep your mouth shut. You are going to accept the fact that your life is over and mine is just beginning. Because if you ever try to pull a stunt like you did tonight, again, I will not just take your money. I will make sure you disappear." He turned around and walked out of my ruined doorway, stepping over the shattered pieces of my laptop. The 2 hired thugs followed him without a backward glance, leaving me alone in the damp, quiet darkness of my apartment. Julian thought he had won. He thought he had terrified me into permanent silence. He had absolutely no idea that his threats had only cemented my resolve. I was not just going to expose him, I was going to obliterate him. But the next morning brought a twist I could never have anticipated. At exactly 9 o'clock, I was sitting at my small kitchen table, drinking a cup of cheap black coffee, when a sleek, jet-black town car pulled up to the curb outside my ground floor window. The tinted windows rolled down slowly, A man in a pristine chauffeur uniform stepped out, walked up to my broken door and handed me a small prepaid burner phone. It was ringing. I answered it cautiously. "Hello. Chloe, my dear," a smooth, deep voice purred on the other end of the line. "This is Richard Kensington. I apologize for the abrupt nature of this call, but given the spectacular display at the country club last night, I felt it was necessary we speak privately. The car is for you. Please let my driver bring you to my office. We have much to discuss." My stomach tied itself into a complicated knot. Richard Kensington was the billionaire patriarch of the family my brother was marrying into. He was the man Julian had just warned me about, the man who supposedly owned the police and the judges. I assumed he was calling to threaten me just like Julian had. I assumed he wanted to silence the crazy sister to protect his daughter's upcoming high society wedding. But my curiosity outweighed my fear. I needed to know what I was up against. I wheeled myself out the front door. The driver expertly deployed a portable ramp and helped secure my chair in the spacious back seat of the luxury vehicle. We drove in complete silence through the morning traffic, heading straight into the heart of the financial district. We arrived at a towering glass skyscraper. The driver escorted me through a private underground parking garage directly to an executive elevator that opened into a massive sunlit corner office. The room smelled of rich mahogany and expensive espresso. Richard Kensington was sitting behind a desk the size of a small dining table. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair, sharp calculating blue eyes, and the relaxed posture of a man who never had to ask permission for anything in his entire life. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed by the scandal at the engagement party. He looked mildly amused. "Please come in, Chloe," he said, gesturing to a space near his desk where the plush carpet had been specifically cleared to accommodate my wheelchair. "Can I offer you anything to drink? Water? Coffee?" "I do not want anything," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I just want to know why I am here. Your future son-in-law threatened my life last night. He told me you would have me thrown in a psychiatric ward if I went to the police." Richard chuckled. It was a cold, dry sound that did not reach his eyes. Julian is a dramatic boy. He lacks refinement. But he's not entirely wrong about how the world works. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. "You put on quite a show last night, Chloe. I must admit, I was impressed by your absolute fearlessness. The medical file, the paramedic reports the suppressed toxicology screens. It was a very compelling presentation." "Then you know I am telling the truth," I said, leaning forward, gripping the armrests of my chair. "You know Julian was driving drunk. You know he broke my spine. And you know he stole $2.5 million from his own paralyzed sister. Why are you still letting him marry your daughter? Why are you protecting a monster?" Richard looked at me with an expression of profound, weary patience. The kind of look a wealthy man gives a child who doesn't understand how the real world operates. "Chloe, let me explain something to you," he said smoothly. "I did not learn about Julian's little indiscretions last night at the party. I have known about the car crash, the driving under the influence, and the stolen settlement for 6 months. The air vanished from my lungs. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he had just confessed. You knew he stole my money and you did nothing." "Why would I do anything?" Richard asked, genuinely puzzled by my moral outrage. "I run a billion-dollar real estate empire, Chloe. I do not let my only daughter marry a stranger without running a comprehensive background check. My private investigators look into everything. Bank records, medical files, sealed police reports. They found the payoff to the local detective. They found the second mortgage your parents took out. I know exactly what your brother is, and I know exactly what your parents did to cover it up." I felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over me. "If you know he is a criminal, why would you let Abigail marry him?" "Because power is about leverage," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, serious timbre. "Julian is ambitious. He is highly educated, greedy, and perfectly willing to step on his own blood to get ahead. Those are excellent qualities for a corporate executive in my organization. But men like Julian are also dangerous because they are disloyal. They turn on you the moment it benefits them." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany desk. "Unless you own them. Do you understand, Chloe? I let the engagement proceed because Julian's crimes are my insurance policy. I have all the evidence of his fraud, his perjury, and your parents' bribery locked away in a vault. Julian thinks he's marrying into my wealth. He thinks he has secured a golden ticket. But next week, my lawyers will present him with a prenuptial agreement that strips him of every single marital right. It will tie him to my company as a highly paid servant. If he ever cheats on Abigail, if he ever steps out of line, if he ever tries to leave my firm, I will hand his entire criminal file over to the federal authorities and send him to prison for a decade. Julian is not my son-in-law. He is my captive employee. I sat completely frozen in my wheelchair. The sheer absolute depravity of the man sitting across from me was staggering. My brother was a monster, but Richard Kensington was the devil holding the leash. He did not care about justice. He did not care that a young woman had lost the use of her legs and her entire financial future. He only saw a convenient piece of blackmail material he could use to control a greedy young executive. I realized in that terrible quiet moment that I was not just fighting my selfish brother or my cruel complicit parents. I was fighting an entire ecosystem of corrupt, wealthy elite who viewed human suffering as a business transaction. Richard opened a desk drawer and pulled out a slim, elegant checkbook. He clicked a gold pen and wrote out a sum with practiced ease. He tore the check from the binding and slid it across the smooth surface of the desk, stopping just at the edge where I could reach it. "I understand you have had a difficult time," Richard said, his tone shifting into a patronizing imitation of sympathy. "I understand your living situation is less than ideal. This is $50,000. Consider it a gift from the Kensington family to help with your medical expenses. All I ask in return is that you stop waving your hospital files around in public. Let Julian marry my daughter. Let me manage his career. You take this money, move to a nicer apartment, and live a quiet, comfortable life. Do we have an understanding?" I looked down at the check. $50,000. To a medical coder drowning in medical debt, living in a dilapidated apartment, $50,000 was a life-changing amount of money. It was enough to move into a luxury, accessible building. It was enough to buy a new, reliable van. It was exactly the kind of money a desperate, broken person would snatch up without a second thought. Richard Kensington expected me to take the money. He expected me to act like a good, quiet little cripple and roll away into the shadows. He expected me to be bought because in his world, everyone had a price. I looked at the zeros on the check, and then I looked up into Richard Kensington's arrogant, calculating blue eyes. The fear that had gripped my chest all morning completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, unyielding steel. I reached out and placed 2 fingers on the edge of the crisp paper check. I did not pick it up. I slowly, deliberately pushed it back across the mahogany desk until it rested directly in front of him. "You think you're so much smarter than my parents?" I said, my voice dropping into that same quiet, resonant space I had found the night before. "You think because you wear a custom suit and sit in a glass tower, you are different from the mechanic and the grocery store clerk who sold out their own daughter. But you are exactly the same, Richard. You are just a parasite feeding on a different kind of rot." Richard's smile vanished instantly. His eyes narrowed, and the charming patriarch was replaced by a cold, ruthless billionaire. "You are making a very foolish mistake, little girl," he warned softly. "You are refusing a generous offer from a man who could crush you with a single phone call. Do not test my patience. You do not have enough money in your entire empire to buy my silence," I said, gripping the wheels of my chair. "And if you think you hold Julian's leash, you are vastly underestimating how fast a rat will chew off its own leg to escape a trap. You want to welcome a monster into your home. You want to build your legacy on my stolen spine. Go right ahead. But do not expect me to smile and take your hush money while you do it." I reversed my wheelchair, the rubber tires gripping the plush carpet. I turned my back on the billionaire patriarch of the Kensington family and rolled straight toward the heavy glass doors. Chloe Richard called out, his voice sharp and angry now. "If you walk out that door, you will get nothing. You will die in that miserable apartment fighting a battle you cannot possibly win." I did not stop. I did not look back. I hit the automatic door release button and rolled out into the executive hallway. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clearer than it had been in 2 entire years. Richard Kensington thought I had no power because I had no money. Julian thought I had no evidence because his thugs had smashed a piece of cheap plastic. My parents thought I would crawl away ashamed because I was bound by the sacred rules of family loyalty. They were all wrong. They were all so incredibly, fatally wrong. I wheeled myself into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The game had just changed. I was not going to settle for an exposure at country club. I was not content on going to settle for humiliating my brother or shaming my parents. I was going to bring down the full crushing weight of the federal government on every single person who had profited from my tragedy. And I knew exactly who to call to make it happen. I navigated my wheelchair out of the towering glass skyscraper that housed the Kensington Empire and rolled out into the damp city air. Richard Kensington thought I was a helpless bug he could squash with a $50,000 check. My parents thought I was a naive burden who would never uncover their hidden safe. Julian thought I was a broken cripple he could intimidate into silence. But as I sat in the back of my accessible transit van, on the ride home, my mind was running through the variables like a finely tuned machine. I knew I could not go to the local police. My father had paid Detective Miller $50,000 in cash to falsify the accident report. If I walked into a local precinct, that same corrupt network would bury my evidence and tip off my family before I even finished giving my statement. I needed a much bigger weapon. I needed someone who operated entirely outside the local ecosystem of bribes and country club handshakes. I needed someone who specialized in taking down untouchable men. When I got back to my apartment, I opened my laptop and began my search. I spent hours analyzing federal court records looking for a specific kind of lawyer. I did not want a family law attorney who would try to mediate a peaceful resolution. I did not want a personal injury lawyer who would settle for quick cash to make the problem disappear. I needed a shark. I needed a veteran litigator who handled massive federal financial crimes, someone who thrived on tearing apart white-collar criminals and dismantling corporate fraud. That is how I found Victor Sterling. Victor Sterling was a legend in the federal courts. He had spent 30 years prosecuting corporate embezzlement, massive insurance fraud, and racketeering. His reputation was ruthless, meticulous, and absolutely unforgiving. He did not care about high society connections or wealthy family names. He cared about paper trails. I printed out every single photograph I had taken of my father's. Black ledger, the forged guardianship papers, the bank transfers, and the suppressed medical files. I compiled them into a thick, heavy binder, put on my best professional suit, and wheeled myself into his downtown office the very next morning. Victor Sterling's office did not smell like rich mahogany and arrogant cologne like Richard Kensington's did. It smelled like black coffee and old paper. Victor was a man in his late 60s with sharp grey eyes and a permanently stern expression. He looked like a man who had heard every lie in the world and had zero patience for any of them. He sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers as he looked down at me in my wheelchair. He told me immediately that he charged a consulting fee I could not possibly afford and that he rarely took new clients unless the case was a guaranteed federal conviction. I did not apologize for taking up his time. I simply placed my heavy binder on his desk and pushed it toward him. I told him my brother paralyzed me in a drunk driving crash, dragged my body to the driver's seat, and then used a forged medical guardianship to steal my $2.5 million disability settlement. Victor leaned back in his leather chair and let out a dry, skeptical sigh. He told me that family disputes over money were common and usually impossible to prove without a taped confession. He said Julian would simply claim he was managing the funds on my behalf for my own long-term medical care. Then opened the binder. I told him, my voice completely calm, "Look at the tab labeled ledger." Victor opened the binder. He flipped past the paramedic reports and the suppressed toxicology screen. He stopped at the high-resolution photographs I had taken of my father's secret handwritten notebook. I watched his grey eyes scan the columns. I watched his expression shift from bored skepticism to absolute laser-focused attention. I explained exactly what he was looking at. I pointed out the $50,000 cash withdrawal logged next to the name of the lead traffic investigator. I pointed out the $30,000 payoff to the hospital lab technician. I showed him the dates of the second mortgage my parents took out on their home to fund the bribes, which aligned perfectly with the days immediately following my catastrophic accident. Finally, I showed him the wire transfers from the insurance payout directly into an offshore limited liability company where Julian was listed as the sole managing director. "This is not a family dispute, Mr. Sterling," I said, gripping the armrests of my chair. "This is a coordinated conspiracy to commit federal insurance fraud, to a wire fraud bribery of a public official, and the outright theft of a multi-million-dollar settlement. My family and the local police are completely compromised. I need you to help me bypass the local authorities and take this straight to the federal government." Victor Sterling closed the binder. He looked at me for a long, silent moment. The stern lines around his mouth softened just a fraction, replaced by the sharp, hungry grin of a predator who had just been handed the perfect hunt. He told me he would take the case on contingency. He would not charge me a single dime up front. He would take his fee from the recovered assets after we tore my brother's entire financial empire straight to the ground. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in silent, calculated preparation. I did not text my parents. I did not call Julian. I let them believe that Richard Kensington's threats had worked. I let them believe I was sitting in my damp, dark apartment, crying over my broken computer and accepting my miserable fate. Meanwhile, Victor and I were building a federal cage around them. Victor bypassed the local police department entirely just as I requested. He went directly to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Insurance Regulatory Commission. Because the stolen settlement crossed state lines through the digital wire transfers to Julian's shell companies, the crime fell strictly under federal jurisdiction. Local bribes could not protect them anymore. I spent hours sitting in secure windowless conference rooms with federal agents. I walked them through every single line of code in my medical files. I showed them exactly how my parents had manipulated the hospital administration to force a heavily medicated minor into signing away her legal rights. The agents brought in their top forensic accountants to trace every single penny of the $2.5 million. The forensic accountants were brilliant, and their findings were absolutely sickening. They traced the money Julian used to buy his luxury sports car straight back to the funds meant for my wheelchair-accessible housing. They traced the specific wire transfer used to purchase Abigail Kensington's massive 4-carat diamond engagement ring, showing it came directly from the account designated for my future physical therapy. They even found a separate hidden account where Julian was hoarding a massive sum of cash, preparing to use my stolen settlement to buy his way into a partnership at his new father-in-law's real estate firm. My brother was literally building his entire wealthy high society persona using the exact dollar value of my paralyzed legs. The lead FBI agent, a seasoned investigator who had taken down massive corporate crime rings, looked at me across the table with genuine disgust in his eyes. He told me he had seen a lot of terrible things in his career, but watching a family mortgage their home to bribe police officers so their golden child could steal his crippled sister's settlement was one of the darkest things he had ever investigated. We had a mountain of undeniable evidence. We had the forged signatures, the bribery ledger, the hidden bank accounts, and the suppressed toxicology reports. The federal agents were ready to arrest Julian and my parents immediately. They wanted to knock down the door of my parents' suburban home and drag them out in handcuffs that very afternoon. But Victor Sterling stopped them. He pointed out a massive flaw in moving too quickly. Julian was a trained financial analyst. He understood how banking systems worked. If we tipped him off even a minute too early, if he caught wind of an impending arrest or saw police cars rolling into my parents' neighborhood, he would panic. With a few clicks on his smartphone, Julian could wire the remaining stolen millions into untraceable offshore accounts. He could liquidate the shell companies and hide the money in cryptocurrency wallets where the federal government might never recover it. If we wanted to ensure I got my life back, we had to trap him completely by surprise. We needed to freeze every single asset he had, but we had to do it exactly when he felt the most secure. The FBI agents agreed. They drafted a comprehensive federal asset freeze. It was an ironclad legal order that would instantly lock down every bank account, every credit card, every trust fund, and every shell company tied to Julie and my parents and the Kensington bribery network. But the execution of that freeze had to be timed down to the exact second. Victor looked at me across the conference table. He asked me when Julian would be completely distracted. He asked me when my brother would be so surrounded by his own arrogance and his high society friends that he would never check his banking apps or notice an alert from his financial advisors. I did not even have to think about it. I knew exactly when Julian would be the most vulnerable. I knew exactly when my parents would be absolutely consumed by their performance of suburban perfection. The rehearsal dinner. In exactly 2 weeks, the Kensington family was hosting a lavish, spectacularly expensive rehearsal dinner at the most exclusive 5-star hotel downtown. It was the night before the wedding, The guest list included the city's elite politicians, banking executives, and wealthy socialites. My parents had been bragging about this dinner for months. They had purchased custom-tailored suits and expensive evening gowns paid for with my stolen money just to prove they belonged in that room. Julian would be standing on a stage giving a toast to his beautiful bride, completely intoxicated by his own fake success. He would feel like an absolute king. I looked at the federal agents and told them the exact date and time. I told them we were going not just to arrest him, but to dismantle his entire illusion in front of the very people he had destroyed me to impress. We would execute the federal asset freeze right in the middle of his grand rehearsal dinner. We would wait until he was standing under the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by everyone he wanted to impress. We would wait until my parents were holding their champagne glasses high, bursting with unearned pride. And then we would take everything away from them. To catch a predator, you have to play dead. That was the first thing Victor Sterling told me when we finalized the plan with the federal agents. We had the evidence securely locked away in federal custody. We had the wire transfer records, the forged medical guardianship signatures, and my father's handwritten ledger detailing the bribes. We had everything we needed to put my brother and my parents in prison for a very long time. But Victor knew that men like Julian and Richard Kensington operated on a different level of paranoia. They had money, and money buys early warning systems. If Julian felt even a fraction of a threat, he would drain those offshore accounts in seconds. He would hide the $2.5 million in cryptocurrency or shell companies that the government could never trace. I would win the criminal case, but I would never see a single dime of my settlement again. We needed Julian to be completely relaxed. We needed my parents to feel absolutely victorious. We needed them to believe that they had successfully crushed me into dust. So, on Wednesday evening, 2 days before the grand rehearsal dinner, I sat at my cheap kitchen table and I pulled out my phone. I opened my text message thread with my father Robert. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I had to swallow every single ounce of my pride to type the words Victor and I had drafted. I had to become the pathetic, helpless victim they always wanted me to be. I took a deep breath and began typing. I wrote that I was sorry. I wrote that my outburst at the country club was a mistake, caused by my medication and my trauma. I told my father that I was completely out of money. I told him my rent was due in 3 days and my landlord was threatening to evict me. I begged him for a tiny loan, just $1,000. I promised I would never bother Julian or Abigail again. I promised I would stay away from the wedding. I literally typed the words, "Please, Dad, I have nowhere else to go." Hitting send on that message felt like swallowing broken glass. For my entire life, I had craved my father's protection. Even after discovering his horrific betrayal, a tiny, naive part of my inner child still wondered if seeing me beg for basic survival might spark a shred of paternal guilt. I sat in the dim light of my apartment watching the screen, watching the little read receipt appear. I waited for his reply. It took exactly 12 minutes for my father to respond. My phone buzzed against the table. I picked it up and read the message that finally severed the last microscopic thread of affection I held for the man who raised me. Robert did not offer help. He did not ask if I was eating. He wrote, "You made your bed, Chloe. You walked into your brother's engagement party and tried to ruin the most important night of his life with your jealous delusions. The Kensington family was deeply disturbed by your behavior. Julian has worked too hard to let your toxic mentality drag him down. We are done paying for your mistakes. You are a grown woman. Grow up, figure out your own rent, and stop blaming your brother for your tragic situation. Do not contact this number again." I did not cry. I simply took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to Victor Sterling. Victor replied 2 minutes later with a single sentence, "The trap is set." My father's cruel message meant our plan had worked perfectly. By begging for rent money, I had convinced them that I was completely destitute. I had convinced them that I had no lawyer, no plan, and no power. Julian would look at that text message and pop a bottle of expensive champagne. Richard Kensington would review his security team reports and assume the annoying little sister had been neutralized. They thought I was sitting alone in the dark, weeping over my eviction notice. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting in a federal staging room, finalizing the tactical execution of a massive asset freeze. The stage for their ultimate destruction was set for Friday night. The Kensington family did not do anything on a small scale. The rehearsal dinner was not a casual gathering of close family. It was a spectacular $100,000 event held at the Grand Plaza Hotel, the most luxurious and exclusive venue in the downtown district. This was an event designed to showcase power. Richard Kensington had invited local politicians, prominent bankers, real estate moguls, and the highest tier of the city's social elite. He was using his daughter's wedding rehearsal to solidify corporate mergers and flex his absolute dominance over the local economy. I knew exactly what the grand ballroom of that hotel looked like. It featured soaring vaulted ceilings dripping with imported crystal chandeliers. The floors were polished marble. The floral arrangements alone cost more than my entire medical coding salary for the year. Julian would be in his element. He would be wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo bought with the money meant to pay for my physical therapy. He would be smiling, holding a glass of vintage wine, wrapping his arm around Abigail, and playing the role of the brilliant young executive who had conquered the world. My parents would be right there beside him. Susan and Robert would be wearing expensive clothes, trying desperately to blend in with the billionaires and politicians. They would be laughing at jokes they did not understand and bragging about their golden son. They would feel invincible. They would look around that opulent room and believe that their terrible sacrifices had finally paid off. They had traded my spine and my future for a seat at the wealthiest table in the city. At 7 o'clock on Friday evening, I was not sitting in my damp apartment. I was sitting in the back of an unmarked black sport utility vehicle parked 3 blocks away from the Grand Plaza Hotel. The rain was falling lightly outside, smearing the city lights into a blur of gold and red against the tinted windows. My heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. I was wearing a sharp, dark, navy-tailored suit. My hair was pulled back perfectly smooth. I did not look like a victim. I looked like a woman who was about to dismantle an empire. Victor Sterling sat in the seat next to me. He was reviewing a thick stack of legal documents illuminated by a small reading light. The federal asset freeze orders were signed by a federal judge just 2 hours prior. The warrants for wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy were finalized and stamped. Victor looked at his expensive wristwatch and nodded. "It is time, Chloe," he said, his voice completely calm. "Let us go introduce ourselves to high society." The sport utility vehicle pulled smoothly into the circular driveway of the Grand Plaza Hotel. The valet attendants in their crisp red uniforms rushed forward to open the doors. They stopped in their tracks when the driver stepped out and flashed a federal badge. The back doors opened. I engaged the motor on my wheelchair and rolled down the customized ramp onto the wet pavement. I was not alone. Victor Sterling walked on my right side, holding his heavy leather briefcase like a weapon. On my left, and trailing just behind us, were 4 plainclothes federal agents. They wore dark suits and carried themselves with the undeniable heavy authority of men who possessed absolute power. They did not look like party guests. They looked like an execution squad. We moved toward the grand entrance of the hotel. The heavy glass doors slid open automatically. The lobby was magnificent, glowing with warm light and echoing with the soft sounds of a string quartet playing somewhere in the distance. The hotel manager, a man in a pristine tuxedo, hurried over to intercept us. He had a polite but firm smile, clearly intending to ask if we were in the right place. Before the manager could even open his mouth to speak, the lead federal agent pulled back his jacket lapel just enough to reveal his badge and his holstered weapon. "We are proceeding to the Kensington rehearsal dinner in the Grand Ballroom," the agent said, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for discussion or delay. "You will not announce us. You will step aside." The hotel manager went pale, swallowed hard, and took a large step backward, gesturing toward the sweeping marble staircase and the elevators. We did not take the service elevator. I did not hide in the back corridors like my mother had ordered me to do at the country club. I wheeled myself directly into the main guest elevator, surrounded by my legal team and the federal agents. The elevator doors closed and began the smooth, rapid ascent to the grand ballroom level. I closed my eyes for just a second. I thought about the cold night I spent on the porch, surrounded by garbage bags when I was 13 years old. I thought about the agonizing months in the rehabilitation hospital, learning how to transfer my paralyzed body from a bed to a chair while carrying the crushing guilt of an accident I did not cause. I thought about my mother holding my hand and forcing me to sign away my future. All of that pain, all of that humiliation had led to this exact moment. The elevator bell chimed softly. The metal door slid open. We stepped out into a lavishly decorated foyer covered in white roses and glowing candles. At the far end of the foyer were the massive double doors leading into the grand ballroom. I could hear the loud, confident chatter of the wealthy guests. I could hear the clinking of fine crystal. I could hear the sound of an elite society celebrating a union built entirely on theft and deception. Victor Sterling looked down at me. He gave me a single curt nod. I reached out and placed my hands firmly on the handles of the heavy ballroom doors. I was no longer the pathetic broken sister begging for rent money. I was no longer the inconvenient cripple, ruining the family aesthetic. I was the lead plaintiff in a massive federal indictment, and I was about to turn their beautiful luxury fairy tale into an absolute nightmare. I pushed the doors open and we walked inside. The heavy mahogany doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom were thick and soundproof, but they could not completely block the booming, amplified voice of Richard Kensington. I sat in my wheelchair in the dimly lit foyer, flanked by Victor Sterling and the 4 federal agents, listening to the billionaire patriarch deliver his toast. His voice echoed through the sound system, dripping with the kind of unearned arrogance that only comes from decades of absolute power. I gripped the rubber rims of my wheels so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I want to raise a glass to a young man who embodies everything this family stands for. Richard said, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. When Julian first came into our lives, I was naturally protective of my daughter. But Julian proved himself to be a man of extraordinary character. He is a man who built his success from the ground up through sheer hard work and unyielding integrity. He is a man who understands that family legacy and trust are the absolute foundation of a meaningful life. Abigail is the most precious thing in my world, and I could not be prouder to welcome Julian into our empire. A chorus of polite, wealthy applause erupted from the hundreds of guests inside. I could hear the delicate clinking of expensive crystal champagne glasses. I closed my eyes for a single second. I pictured my brother standing on that stage, soaking in the adoration, smiling his perfect bright smile. I pictured my parents sitting at the head table, practically weeping with pride over their golden child. They were celebrating a life built entirely on my shattered spine. I opened my eyes and looked up at Victor Sterling. He gave me a slow, steady nod. The lead federal agent stepped forward and firmly pushed the heavy brass handles of the double doors. The door swung inward with a smooth, silent glide opening completely to reveal the spectacular opulence of the grand ballroom. The space was absolutely breathtaking. Thousands of white roses and orchids cascaded from massive golden vases on every single table. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of local politicians, banking executives, and high society elites. On the raised stage at the front of the room stood Julian. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit him perfectly. Abigail stood beside him wearing a stunning designer gown, her hand resting delicately on his arm, so the 4-carat diamond ring could catch the light. Richard Kensington stood at the microphone with a champagne flute raised high. My parents, Robert and Susan, were seated at the table of honor directly below the stage, beaming at their son. Behind the stage, a massive 30-foot projection screen displayed a high-definition photograph of Julian and Abigail kissing under the Eiffel Tower in Paris. The entire room was a monument to stolen wealth. I pushed my hands forward against my wheels. The rubber tires rolled smoothly over the plush carpet as I crossed the threshold. Victor Sterling walked on my right side, his expensive leather briefcase gripped tightly in his hand. The 4 federal agents fanned out slightly, walking with the heavy, undeniable presence of law enforcement. At first, only the guests near the back of the room noticed us. A few people lowered their champagne glasses, frowning in confusion at the sight of a woman in a wheelchair disrupting a private high society event. Then the whispers started. The murmurs rippled forward through the crowd, moving like a wave from the back tables all the way to the front. People began to step aside, parting like the Red Sea, to create a wide, clear path for me down the center of the ballroom. I pushed my wheels with slow, deliberate rhythm. I did not look at the wealthy strangers staring at me. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage. As the whispering grew louder, Richard Kensington stopped mid-sentence. He lowered his champagne glass and squinted against the bright stage lights, trying to see what was causing the commotion. Julian turned his head. The moment my brother's eyes met mine, his perfect, triumphant smile vanished. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked as though he had been physically struck. His mouth fell open in absolute terror. Down at the head table, my mother Susan let out a sharp, audible gasp that was picked up by a nearby microphone. She dropped her wine glass. It shattered against a porcelain plate, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth, like blood. My father Robert half stood from his chair, his face twisting into a mask of pure panic. I stopped my wheelchair, exactly dead center of the ballroom floor, directly in front of the stage. The entire room of 300 elites fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard Kensington demanded, leaning into the microphone, his voice booming with sudden fury. "Who let these people in here? Security! Get security in here immediately!" Julian did not wait for security. The sight of me sitting there, staring up at him with absolute cold defiance, shattered the last remaining fragment of his carefully constructed facade. He forgot about his wealthy guests. He forgot about the politicians watching him. He only saw the sister he had thrown away coming back to destroy his perfect life. "You crazy, twisted cripple!" Julian screamed, his voice completely unhinged, cracking with desperate rage. "I told you to stay away from us. I told you I would have you locked up." He lunged forward. He leaped down the 3 wooden steps of the stage, ignoring Abigail, who cried out in shock as he pulled away from her. He charged straight toward me, his hands curled into fists, his face contorted into an ugly, violent snarl. He was going to grab my wheelchair. He was going to push me over again, just like he had done at the engagement party. He wanted to physically break me in front of everyone, because violence was the only language he had left. He never even made it within 5 feet of me. Before Julian could lay a single finger on my chair, the lead federal agent moved with terrifying speed. The agent stepped firmly in front of me, intercepting Julian's violent charge. The agent grabbed Julian's outstretched wrist, twisted it sharply inward, and slammed a heavy hand directly into the center of Julian's chest. The sheer force of the professional tactical maneuver stopped my brother dead in his tracks and sent him stumbling backward. "Do not take another step toward this woman," the federal agent commanded, his voice cutting through the silent room like a steel blade. "Federal agent, you will remain exactly where you are." Julian hit the floor hard, landing on his hands and knees. His custom tuxedo jacket bunched up awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked up at the agent, panting heavily, his eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing realization. The word federal hung in the air above the ballroom, echoing against the crystal chandeliers. My father tried to rush forward from the head table, but another plainclothes agent immediately stepped into his path, holding up a hand that signaled absolute authority. "Do not interfere, sir," the agent warned quietly. "Return to your seat." The wealthy guests in the room were completely frozen. Some were clutching their pearls literally, while others were staring in morbid fascination. They had come for a celebration of high society dominance, and instead, they were witnessing the brutal reality of a federal takedown. Victor Sterling stepped forward smoothly, taking his place beside my wheelchair. He looked up at Richard Kensington, who was still standing at the microphone, clutching the podium with white knuckles. "Mr. Kensington," Victor said, projecting his deep, resonant voice so the entire room could hear him clearly without a microphone. "My name is Victor Sterling. I am the legal counsel representing Miss Chloe here. We are not here to disrupt your dinner party out of spite. We are here to present the undeniable truth about the man you're preparing to welcome into your family." I reached into my lap and pulled out a small wireless remote control. Victor and I had planned this execution flawlessly. An hour before the dinner began, federal agents had visited the audiovisual control booth at the back of the ballroom. They had served the young, terrified hotel technician with a federal subpoena compelling his absolute cooperation. The technician had quietly connected a secure encrypted laptop to the main projection system, waiting for my signal. Julian pushed himself up from the floor, his chest heaving. He looked frantically between me, Victor, and the federal agents. "Chloe, whatever you think you are doing, stop it right now," he pleaded, his voice shaking with a pathetic, desperate whine. "Abigail, please do not listen to her. She is sick. Her brain was damaged in the crash. She makes things up." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply looked at my brother and pressed the button on my wireless remote. Behind the stage, the massive 30-foot projection screen flickered. The beautiful romantic photograph of Julian and Abigail in Paris instantly vanished. The screen went black for a fraction of a second before a new image illuminated the ballroom. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Displayed on the giant screen in crisp high definition was the original unredacted paramedic intake report from the night of my accident. The words were magnified so massively that even the guests at the very back of the room could read them clearly. I had instructed the technician to highlight specific sentences in bright yellow. Patient found unconscious in the driver's seat, but exhibits severe blunt force trauma and seatbelt contusions consistent with a passenger side impact. The steering wheel airbag deployed, but the blood spatter on the driver's side fabric does not match the unconscious patient's blood type. I looked at the crowd. My voice was calm, carrying easily in the dead silence. 2 years ago, my brother Julian drove his car into a tree while heavily intoxicated. To save his own finance career from a felony conviction, he dragged my paralyzed, unconscious body across the center console and shoved me behind the steering wheel. He let the police blame me. He let the insurance companies blame me. And he let me wake up in a hospital believing I had destroyed my own life. Julian let out a guttural sound of denial, shaking his head wildly. "That is forged," he shouted, pointing at the screen. "She forged that document." I pressed the button on my remote a second time. The image on the screen shifted seamlessly. The new document displayed was the Suppress Hospital Toxicology Report. The bright yellow highlighted section clearly showed Julian's full name, his date of birth, and a blood alcohol content reading of 0.18 from the night of the crash. The official seal of the Regional Trauma Center was plainly visible in the corner of the document. Abigail Kensington stumbled backward on the stage, covering her mouth with both trembling hands. She stared down at Julian, who was still kneeling on the floor looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. I pressed the button for the third time. The screen changed to the temporary medical guardianship order, the document my parents had forced me to sign while I was drowning in fentanyl and intensive care unit monitors. My weak, shaky signature was blown up to massive proportions for the entire room to witness. Right next to it was the detailed banking wire transfer history retrieved directly by federal forensic accountants. The crowd fell into an even deeper, horrified silence as they read the numbers on the screen. The wire transfer showed exactly how the $2.5 million from my permanent disability settlement had been funneled out of my medical trust. The money had moved from the insurance provider straight into a shell company controlled entirely by Julian. And then I showed them exactly what he bought with my legs. I hit the button again. The screen split into two images. On the left side was a clear, undeniable bank transfer for $85,000 wired from Julian's shell company to a luxury auto dealership. On the right side was an invoice for $120,000 from an exclusive New York jeweler. The invoice detailed the purchase of a custom 4-carat diamond engagement ring, the exact ring currently sitting on Abigail Kensington's left hand. I looked directly at Abigail. My voice remained steady, but laced with absolute undeniable truth. "Your fiancé did not buy that ring with his hard-earned corporate salary, Abigail. He bought it with the money that was supposed to pay for my wheelchair-accessible housing. He bought it with the money meant for my physical therapy. He built his entire wealthy persona using the cash meant to compensate me for the fact that I will never walk again." Abigail looked down at her hand. She stared at the massive glittering diamond as if it were a poisonous spider resting on her finger. She looked like she was going to be physically sick right there on the stage. Richard Kensington gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles pure white. He had known about the bribery. He had known about the stolen money. He had planned to use it as blackmail to control Julian, but Richard had never planned for his future son-in-law to be publicly completely exposed as a monstrous thief in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the state. Richard's entire reputation was built on trust and legacy, and now his daughter was standing on a stage wearing stolen jewelry. The humiliation was absolute. I pressed the button one final time. The screen behind the stage switched to the most important document of the night. It was a formal federal indictment. The paper bore the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The text was thick, bold, and uncompromising. The United States of America versus Julian. The charges listed below his name were devastating. Wire fraud, federal insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, forgery of medical and legal documents. I let the image burn into the minds of every single guest in that ballroom. I let Julian stare at the document that officially ended his entire life. He was no longer a wealthy corporate executive. He was no longer the golden boy of the family. He was a federal criminal facing decades in prison, and his entire downfall was playing out live on a 30-foot screen for all his precious high society friends to see. The words of the formal federal indictment loomed on the massive 30-foot projection screen, casting a harsh, glaring white light across the opulent grand ballroom. The silence in the room was so absolute, it felt as though all 300 wealthy guests had simultaneously stopped breathing. My brother Julian was on his knees, his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo wrinkled and twisted, his face pale and slick with a terrified sweat. He stared at the giant projection of his own impending doom, and for the very first time in his pampered, entitled life, he had absolutely no words to manipulate his way out of the truth. I sat in my wheelchair at the center of the room, surrounded by the federal agents, and watched the reality of his monumental crimes sink into the minds of the local politicians, banking executives, and high society elites. Then a sound pierced the suffocating heavy quiet. It was a sharp melodic ringtone echoing brightly from the stage. Abigail Kensington jumped. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached into her small crystal designer clutch to retrieve her phone. She stared at the glowing screen, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. In a room full of billionaires and socialites, nobody answers a phone call during a catastrophic public confrontation. But the caller identification must have demanded her immediate attention because she slowly raised the phone to her ear. "Hello," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling and incredibly small. The room was so deeply quiet that I could faintly hear the frantic, urgent voice of the caller on the other end of the line. I watched Abigail's perfectly contoured face transform from shock to total bewildered panic. "What do you mean it was declined?" she asked, her voice rising in sheer disbelief. "We pre-authorized the payment this morning. Run the card again. There has to be a mistake." Suddenly, the heavy wooden side doors of the ballroom swung open. A sharply dressed woman clutching a leather clipboard burst into the room. It was the head event planner for the Grand Plaza Hotel. She looked absolutely terrified, but professionally determined as she marched straight past the staring politicians and approached the edge of the stage. She did not even look at the massive federal indictment projected on the screen. She only cared about securing the funds for her venue. Miss Kensington, the event planner, said, her voice loud enough to carry across the front row of tables. "I am so deeply sorry to interrupt this evening, but our accounting department just received a hard terminal rejection on the platinum credit card Mr. Julian provided for tonight. We tried to process the $100,000 hold for the catering and the ballroom rental, but the bank returned a code we have never seen before. They informed us that the account has been completely seized." Julian scrambled to his feet. He reached frantically into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his smartphone. His hands were shaking so badly, he almost dropped the device onto the polished hardwood floor of the stage. He typed his secure passcode, his eyes wide and panicked, breathing heavily through his mouth. He opened his private offshore banking application. I watched him from my wheelchair, feeling the cold, hard satisfaction of a promise completely fulfilled. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at his checking accounts. He was looking at his high-yield savings. He was looking at the offshore limited liability company where he had stashed the remaining millions he stole from my medical trust. They were all gone. Every single balance on his screen read zero. The federal asset freeze that Victor Sterling and the federal investigators had meticulously orchestrated had executed perfectly. At exactly 8 o'clock, while Julian was standing on a stage bragging about his integrity and his immense wealth, the United States government had locked down his entire financial existence. He was completely and absolutely destitute. "This is a mistake," Julian stammered, hitting the refresh button on his phone over and over again, his voice cracking with hysteria. "The servers must be down. My money is there. I have millions. I have millions of dollars." "You have nothing, Julian," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the space between us. "Every dollar you stole from my settlement, every asset you purchased with my blood, every account you tried to hide offshore has been frozen by the federal government. You cannot buy your way out of this. You cannot bribe another detective. You cannot take out another mortgage on our parents' house. Your money is gone and it is never coming back." The lead federal agent stepped forward. He did not ask for permission. He did not care that he was standing in front of the most powerful corporate leaders in the city. He walked directly up the wooden steps of the stage and approached my brother. 2 other plainclothes agents followed closely behind him, pulling cold, heavy steel handcuffs from their leather belts. "Julian Michael Myers," the lead agent said, his voice booming with undeniable authority, You are under arrest for wire fraud, federal insurance fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Julian backed away, his hands raised defensively, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "Now wait," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You do not understand. This is a family dispute. She is my sister. We can handle this privately. I did not mean to hurt her. I was just trying to protect my career. Please do not do this to me." The federal agents did not hesitate. They grabbed Julian's arms, twisted them firmly but professionally behind his back, and clamped the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly through the ballroom, sealing his fate. Julian began to panic, thrashing weakly against the unyielding grip of the federal agents. He looked down at the head table where our parents were sitting. Robert and Susan were completely paralyzed. My mother was weeping silently, her hands covering her mouth, her perfect suburban facade completely and permanently destroyed. My father was gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles, his face a sickly shade of gray, staring in absolute horror at the son he had sacrificed my life to protect. "Dad, help me!" Julian screamed, his voice raw and desperate, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Do something. Call someone. Call your lawyer. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you handled the money. Tell them you told me to do it. Tell them about the bribes." My father did not move. He did not speak. He simply stared at the floor, entirely broken. In that moment, Julian realized his parents could not save him. They had no money left. They had no power. The federal asset freeze had locked their accounts too. They were just as exposed and ruined as he was. So Julian turned to the only person left in the room who possessed the kind of immense wealth that could make massive legal problems disappear. He turned to his beautiful, wealthy fiancée. "Abigail, please." Julian begged, tears streaming down his face as the agents held him firmly in place. "Abigail, you know me. You know I love you. My sister is just vindictive. She set me up to ruin us. Please tell your father to call the police chief. Tell your father to use his influence. We are supposed to get married tomorrow, Abigail. We are supposed to start a family. Please do not let them take me away to a cell." Abigail Kensington stood perfectly still on the stage. The beautiful, expensive designer gown she wore suddenly looked like a tragic costume. She looked at Julian, the man she had planned to marry, the man who had charmed her with tales of his brilliant financial success and his heroic rescue of his poor, paralyzed sister. She looked at the giant projection screen displaying the undeniable proof that he was a monster who had left me broken and bleeding to save his own skin, and then she looked down at her own hand. She stared at the massive 4-carat diamond engagement ring glittering under the bright stage lights. The exact ring purchased with the funds meant to provide me with a wheelchair-accessible home. The ring bought with the money meant to pay for my lifelong physical therapy. Abigail's expression shifted dramatically. The initial shock and confusion melted away completely, replaced by a profound, icy disgust. The Kensington family did not tolerate public humiliation, and they certainly did not tolerate being played for absolute fools by a broke, desperate criminal. Abigail reached over with her right hand and pinched the cold metal band of the engagement ring. She slid it slowly and deliberately off her finger. She did not say a single word to Julian. She did not yell or cry or demand an explanation. She simply extended her arm over the floorboards and dropped the 4-carat diamond. The heavy ring hit the floor with a sharp metallic clatter. It bounced once, rolled for a few inches, and came to a dead stop right next to Julian's expensive leather shoes. Julian stared down at the ring, his entire body going limp in the grip of the federal agents. He knew exactly what that simple, quiet gesture meant. It was the ultimate discard. He was no longer the golden boy. He was no longer the rising star of the Kensington real estate empire. He was just a thief heading to federal prison with absolutely no one left to protect him. Abigail turned her back on him, gathered the long sweeping skirts of her luxurious gown, and walked gracefully off the stage without ever looking back. Richard Kensington, however, was not going to simply walk away in silence. The billionaire patriarch had a massive corporate reputation to protect. He saw the wealthy guests whispering and pointing. He saw the local politicians pulling out their phones, probably texting their damage control teams to legally distance themselves from his family. Richard needed to control the public narrative immediately. He needed to make sure everyone in that room believed he was a completely innocent victim of Julian's deception, just like everyone else. Richard stepped up to the microphone, his face a perfect mask of righteous indignation and paternal outrage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his deep voice projecting powerfully across the silent ballroom. "I am absolutely appalled and sickened by the revelations presented here tonight. The Kensington family had absolutely no knowledge of this young man's criminal history or his depraved, sickening actions toward his own disabled sister. We were completely deceived. We welcome this federal investigation with open arms, and we will fully cooperate with the authorities to ensure that justice is swiftly served. My family stands for integrity and truth, and we completely sever all personal and professional ties with Julian Myers, effective immediately." It was a masterful theatrical performance. Richard sounded exactly like a shocked and betrayed father protecting his innocent daughter from a ruthless con artist. A few people in the crowd actually murmured in sympathetic agreement, nodding their heads at the billionaire's strong words. But I was not there to let Richard Kensington play the innocent victim. And neither was Victor Sterling. Victor unclasped the brass latches of his heavy leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, crisp manila envelope bearing the official embossed seal of the United States Department of Justice. He walked calmly toward the front of the stage, his gray eyes locked entirely onto the billionaire. Richard Kensington watched Victor approach. A brief, genuine flicker of unease crossed the patriarch's confident face. "That is a very moving and dramatic speech, Mr. Kensington," Victor said, his voice echoing loudly and clearly, holding the undivided attention of every single person in the room. "It is truly remarkable how quickly and eloquently you can express public horror at a crime you have secretly known about for 6 entire months." The ballroom went dead silent once again. The wealthy guests leaned forward, their eyes darting rapidly between Victor and Richard. Richard stiffened his face, flushing a dark, angry red. "I do not know what you are talking about," he demanded, his voice dropping its smooth charm and taking on a harsh, threatening tone. "I suggest you leave my property before I have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." "You do not own the federal government," Richard Victor replied smoothly, ascending the wooden steps of the stage with quiet confidence. "You stood in your private office yesterday morning and openly admitted to my client that your private investigators had uncovered the entire scope of Julian's fraud, including the bribery of a local police detective and the theft of a $2.5 million medical settlement." Victor stopped exactly 2 feet away from the billionaire, forcing Richard to look him in the eye. "You did not report this severe felony to the authorities," Victor continued, his voice ringing like a bell through the silent room. "Instead, you chose to actively conceal a federal crime. You chose to use the undeniable evidence of Julian's guilt as a calculated blackmail tool, intending to force him into a highly restrictive prenuptial agreement and secure his permanent legal loyalty to your real estate firm. You offered my client $50,000 in hush money to quietly cover up a multi-million-dollar federal insurance fraud so your family could maintain its pristine public image." Richard Kensington's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked out at the sea of his wealthy peers, his purchased politicians, and his banking friends. He saw the absolute horror and quiet judgment reflecting back at him from the crowd. The untouchable, powerful billionaire had been caught in his own trap. Victor Sterling held out the heavy manila envelope and pressed it directly into Richard Kensington's chest, forcing the man to take it. "Richard Kensington," Victor declared with brutal public finality, "you are hereby officially served with a federal subpoena. You are ordered to appear before a federal grand jury to answer highly specific questions regarding your active conspiracy to conceal a federal crime, obstruction of justice, and attempted witness tampering. Do not plan any long luxury vacations. The Department of Justice will be seeing you very soon." Richard stared down at the thick envelope in his hands, his pristine reputation crumbling into ash right before his eyes. The lead federal agent jerked Julian forward by the steel handcuffs. "Let us go," the agent said roughly. They marched Julian down the stairs of the stage and led him straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The crowd parted widely, allowing the broken criminal to be paraded past the very people he had spent years trying to impress. As Julian walked past my wheelchair, he refused to look at me. He kept his head bowed, staring intensely at the floor, a broken, pathetic man who had finally run out of lies and innocent people to exploit. I sat in my chair, my heart completely calm and my mind perfectly clear. I watched the heavy wooden ballroom doors close behind the federal agents, taking my brother away to a concrete cell. I watched my parents weeping silently at their empty table, realizing they had lost their house, their money, their reputation, and their only son. I watched Richard Kensington standing humiliated on a stage, clutching a federal subpoena, while his guests slowly began to turn their backs and walk away. They had taken my legs, they had taken my trust, they had taken my money. But tonight, standing in the wreckage of their shattered lives, I knew I had taken their entire world. The heavy wooden doors closed behind Julian, and the federal agents, sealing his fate and cutting off the sound of his frantic, pathetic begging. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel fell into a deafening, heavy silence. 300 of the most powerful people in the city were completely frozen in place, their expensive champagne glasses resting forgotten on white linen tables, their custom-tailored clothes suddenly feeling like heavy, suffocating armor. They had just watched a brutal federal takedown of a man they thought was a rising corporate star. Now their eyes slowly turned back to the center of the room. They looked at me sitting quietly in my wheelchair, and then they turned their collective gaze to the table of honor sitting just below the grand stage. My father, Robert, and my mother, Susan, were standing by their chairs. Their faces were the exact color of wet ash. The arrogant pride they had worn all evening bragging about their golden son to billionaires and politicians had completely evaporated. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy suburban family was shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces right before their eyes. My mother took a shaky step forward. Her knees gave out instantly. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive designer dress pulling around her in a tragic, messy heap. She began to weep. It was not the delicate, performative crying she used to garner sympathy from her country club friends when she talked about her poor, paralyzed daughter. It was the ugly, guttural, heaving sobbing of a woman who had just realized she had absolutely nothing left. My father rushed forward, dropping to his knees right beside her. These two people who had stood tall and looked down on me for my entire life, who had treated me like an inconvenient burden, were now kneeling on the ground directly in front of my wheelchair. They crawled toward me over the imported carpets. They reached out their trembling hands toward my knees. Chloe, my mother, sobbed her tears, ruining her pristine makeup, making dark streaks down her pale cheeks. Chloe, please, you have to stop this. You have to call those agents back. We did not know what Julian was doing. He manipulated us. He lied to us. We were just scared parents trying to help our son. He told us it was a minor accident. He told us he just needed a little help with some paperwork. We had no idea he was stealing your money. We would never have let him do that to you. My father reached out and tried to grab the metal armrest of my wheelchair. Chloe, you are our daughter, he pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer naked desperation. We love you. We have always loved you. Julian tricked us into signing those loans. He threatened us. He said he would lose his job and we would be disgraced. We were under so much pressure. You have to believe us. We are your family. We can fix this. We can hire lawyers and get your money back. Just please do not let them put us in prison. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the top of my father's graying head. I looked at my mother's tear-stained face. 2 years ago, I would have done anything to hear them say they loved me. I would have given everything I had just to see them drop to their knees and beg for my forgiveness. But sitting there in that massive ballroom surrounded by silent, wealthy strangers, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no warmth. There was no pity. There was only the cold, hard reality of the truth. I did not pull my chair away. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly into my mother's panicked eyes with absolute ice. You are lying, I said, my voice steady and perfectly level, carrying across the silent room so that every politician and banker could hear their shame. You are still lying even now, when the entire world knows exactly what you did. Julian did not manipulate you. Julian did not trick you into paying a $50,000 cash bribe to a corrupt police detective. Julian did not force you to stand by my hospital bed and guide my medicated hand to forge a legal document while I was paralyzed and terrified. You did that. You made those choices because you looked at my broken body and decided I was completely worthless. I unzipped the side pocket of my canvas bag, which was resting securely on my lap. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. They were the color copies of the documents I had taken directly from my father's hidden safe earlier that week. I held them up so my parents could see the familiar signatures and the black ink ledgers. My father's eyes widened in absolute horrifying realization as he recognized his own handwritten notes detailing the payoffs. "These are the records from your personal vault," I said, dropping the papers onto the floor right in front of their trembling hands. "These are the bank statements for the second mortgage you took out on the family home. The home you prize above everything else. You leveraged your entire safe suburban life to get the cash you needed to bribe the hospital staff and the police investigator. You thought you were buying your son's freedom. You thought you were protecting your golden child from a felony conviction." I paused, letting the weight of their actions hang in the stale ballroom air. "But you do not understand how federal law works," I continued, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority. "When you use a bank mortgage to fund the bribery of public officials in order to cover up a federal wire fraud scheme, that money becomes illicit. The house you used as collateral is now tied directly to a massive federal crime. Victor Sterling and the federal agents did not just freeze Julian's offshore accounts tonight. Because you used illicit bribe money tied to your mortgage to cover up a felony, the federal government is seizing your house under civil asset forfeiture." My mother let out a loud, agonizing wail. She clutched her chest, rocking back and forth on the floor as if she had been physically stabbed. My father stared at the scattered papers, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating shock. "The federal government is taking your house," I told them, watching their entire world collapse. "They are seizing your bank accounts, your retirement funds, and your cars. You are not going back to your perfect suburban life. You are not going back to your country club dinners. By tomorrow morning, federal agents will be locking the doors of your home, and you will not be allowed to step foot inside it ever again. You sacrificed your daughter to save your son, and in the process, you burned your own lives completely to the ground. Please, Chloe," my mother begged, grabbing the edge of my footrest, her fingers gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Please do not do this. Where will we go? We have nothing. We are too old to start over. You cannot leave us on the street. You are our flesh and blood. You have your settlement money back now. You are rich. You can afford to help us. Please have mercy on us." I looked down at her, clinging to my wheelchair, crying and begging for the exact same mercy she had actively denied me when she ordered the country club security to throw me out into the rain. I remembered the cold, damp night in my terrible apartment when I realized they had left me with absolutely nothing. I remembered the sheer terror of waking up paralyzed and being told it was all my own fault. I reached down and gently but firmly peeled my mother's fingers off the metal frame of my wheelchair. I looked her directly in the eyes, stripping away the last remaining illusion of our relationship. "You told me family requires sacrifice." I said, my words landing like heavy stones in the quiet ballroom. "You told me I had to give up my youth, my savings, and my future for my brother. Now you get to sacrifice everything for him." I engaged the motor on my wheelchair. I turned the chair around smoothly, turning my back on my weeping parents. I did not look at them again. I did not look at Richard Kensington, who was standing silently by the stage, completely ruined and humiliated in front of his billionaire peers. I did not look at the wealthy politicians who were awkwardly staring at their expensive shoes. I simply rolled forward. Victor Sterling walked beside me, his heavy leather briefcase swinging slightly at his side. The federal agents cleared a wide path toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. The sound of my wheelchair tires on the plush carpet was the only sound in the room other than the pathetic, hysterical sobbing of my mother and father echoing far behind me. As I crossed the threshold, leaving the opulent crystal-lit room, I felt a physical, massive weight lift from my chest. For 2 agonizing years, I had carried the crushing burden of their betrayal. I had believed their lies. I had hated myself for a crash I did not cause. I had accepted my role as the broken, invisible burden. But as I rolled down the quiet, carpeted hallway toward the elevators, that burden vanished completely. They had tried to bury me alive, but I had dug my way out and built a fortress out of the dirt they threw on me. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent. Victor Sterling looked down at me and gave a small, respectful nod. We did not need to celebrate. The work was done. When we reached the ground floor, the valet brought my accessible van to the curb. The rain was still falling gently, washing the city streets clean. I used the mechanical lift to get into the van, secured my chair, and drove away from the Grand Plaza Hotel, leaving my former family to face the absolute permanent destruction of the lives they had built on my suffering. It has been 6 months since that night at the rehearsal dinner. The fallout was spectacular and absolute. Julian was denied bail due to his attempts to wire money offshore. He is currently sitting in a federal detention center awaiting trial for a list of felonies that will undoubtedly keep him behind bars for at least 15 years. Without the Kensington wealth or my stolen money to hire elite defense lawyers, he was assigned an overworked public defender. Abigail Kensington completely erased him from her life. The Kensington family spent millions on public relations, trying to distance themselves from the scandal, but Richard's reputation never fully recovered. He was forced to step down as the chief executive officer of his own company, while the federal grand jury investigates his attempts to conceal Julian's crimes. As for my parents, their ruin was total and permanent. The federal government seized the suburban house, the cars, and the bank accounts, just as I promised. With no assets and a pending criminal investigation for bribery and obstruction of justice, they were forced to move into a tiny rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. My father, who once prided himself on his tailored suits and his country club memberships, is now working a minimum wage job as a night shift security guard just to pay for their groceries. My mother, who cared more about appearances than she cared about her own daughter, can no longer show her face in any of her old social circles. They have absolutely nothing. No golden child to brag about. No money to hide behind, and no home to call their own. Meanwhile, the federal authorities successfully recovered the entire $2.5 million settlement from Julian's frozen shell companies. The money was transferred into a secure, heavily guarded trust in my name, exactly as it should have been 2 years ago. I finally moved out of that terrible, cramped apartment. I bought a beautiful modern home with wide hallways, lowered counters, and a massive accessible kitchen where I can cook and live with complete independence. I hired the best physical therapists in the state, not to cure my paralysis, but to help me build strength and navigate my life with total confidence. I bought a new customized van that allows me to travel wherever I want, whenever I want. I am still a medical coder. I still love my job finding the truth hidden in the numbers, but I no longer work 60-hour weeks to pay off someone else's debts. I work because I enjoy it and because I know exactly how powerful a single line of data can be. I learned the hard way that family is not defined by blood or shared last names. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, love, or protection. Sometimes the people who share your DNA are the very same people who will willingly push you under a bus to protect their own selfish interests. Family is defined by the people who stand by you when you are broken, by the people who fight for your truth when the rest of the world tells you to stay quiet. You cannot choose the family you are born into, but you absolutely possess the power to choose what you accept from them. You do not have to swallow abuse, manipulation, or theft just because society tells you that family comes first. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. Walking away from toxic people is not a failure. Exposing the truth, even when it destroys the illusion of a perfect family, is the ultimate act of self-respect. I lost my ability to walk, but I found my voice. I lost my parents, but I found my freedom. And no amount of money, no luxury car, and no country club membership can ever buy the kind of peace I feel every single morning when I wake up in a home that belongs entirely to me. If you have stayed with me until the very end of this story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, if you have ever been told you are the problem just because you refused to stay silent about the truth, I hope my journey reminds you of your own strength. You are not crazy, you are not a burden, and you deserve absolute justice. Please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if this story resonated with you. It truly helps these messages reach the people who need to hear them most. And before you go, drop a comment below letting me know what city or country you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Remember to always stand up for yourself and never let anyone convince you that your truth does not matter. 2 years have passed since I rolled out of that grand ballroom and left my former family kneeling in the wreckage of their own deceit. 2 years can feel like an absolute lifetime when you are completely rebuilding your existence from the ground up. Today, the rhythmic squeaking of rubber against polished linoleum and the sharp scent of clinical antiseptic fill my mornings. But it is not the depressing smell of a neglected public hospital. It is the bright, energetic atmosphere of a state-of-the-art, private physical therapy and rehabilitation facility. I am standing right now My hands are gripping the molded handles of custom titanium forearm crutches. My muscles shake and sweat beads on my forehead, but my feet are firmly planted on the ground. When I take a step, it is slow and it requires immense concentrated effort. But it is a step. Taking that single step took 5 grueling reconstructive spinal surgeries performed by the absolute best neurosurgeons in the country. It took thousands of hours of agonizing physical therapy where I had to relearn how to send signals from my brain to my legs. None of this would have been possible without the truth. The cutting-edge surgeries, the daily private therapy sessions, and the specialized equipment were all funded by my recovered settlement. The federal government successfully seized every single penny of the $2.5 million from Julian's offshore accounts and placed it back where it rightfully belonged. It was not just money returned to me. It was my future handed back to me. It was the physical mobility they tried to steal so they could buy luxury cars and diamond rings. But I did not just rebuild my body. I took my professional experience and my recovered independence and I built an entirely new life. I no longer work 60-hour weeks in a dark cubicle, making a massive hospital network richer while paying off my brother's debts. I took my expertise as a medical coder and I opened my own medical billing consultancy. I lease a beautiful bright corner office with wide accessible doorways and large windows that let the sunlight pour in all day long. My firm specializes in helping regular people fight back against predatory insurance practices. I take on clients who have been unfairly denied coverage, who are drowning in confusing medical debt, and who feel completely helpless against a system designed to crush them. I employ a team of dedicated professionals, many of whom also navigate life with disabilities. We audit hospital bills, we appeal denied claims, and we force massive insurance conglomerates to pay what they owe to the people who need it most. Every single time I win an appeal for a terrified patient, I feel a profound sense of justice. I am using the very skills my family exploited to empower others who have been discarded and ignored. While my life has expanded into something beautiful and deeply fulfilling, the people who tried to destroy me have faced the absolute reality of their choices. Julian. Michael Myers, the so-called golden boy, the brilliant financial analyst, the man who believed he was untouchable, did not get a gentle slap on the wrist. The federal justice system does not care about your custom-tailored tuxedos or your country club charm. The trial was swift, and it was absolutely brutal. Victor Sterling made sure that every piece of evidence was presented with razor-sharp clarity. Julian's high society friends vanished the moment the indictment was unsealed. Richard Kensington used his immense wealth and influence to completely distance his family from the scandal, ensuring Julian had absolutely no access to elite legal defense. Julian stood in the federal courtroom wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, looking incredibly small and pathetic. He cried when the judge read the verdict. He begged for leniency, claiming he made a youthful mistake under pressure. The judge looked down at him with total disgust and handed down a sentence of 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. 12 years with no possibility of early parole. My brother spends his days in a bleak concrete cell surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards a million miles away from the luxury and power he thought he was entitled to steal. Abigail Kensington annulled the engagement the very morning after the rehearsal dinner. She moved on immediately and married a wealthy hedge fund manager less than a year later. In the world Julian sacrificed his sister to enter, he was completely forgotten before the ink on his prison sentence was even dry. And then there are my parents, Robert and Susan, the people who mortgaged their souls and their family home to bribe a corrupt police detective. The federal civil asset forfeiture was ruthless and absolute, because they used their home equity to fund the bribery and conceal a massive federal wire fraud. The government seized their beautiful, pristine suburban house. They seized their retirement accounts. They seized their vehicles and every single asset tied to their criminal conspiracy. Today, Robert and Susan live in a rusted single-wide trailer in a rundown, dilapidated park on the very outskirts of the city. The people who once bragged endlessly about artisanal wedding cakes and expensive country club dinners are now facing the harsh, unforgiving reality of extreme poverty in their late 60s. To survive, they were forced to take minimum-wage retail jobs. My father, the man who loved to sit behind a mahogany desk and feel important, now works the overnight shift, stocking heavy boxes on the shelves of a big box discount store. His knees and back ache, and he takes orders from managers decades younger than him. My mother, the woman who cared more about her public image than she cared about her own daughter's life, now stands behind a cash register, scanning groceries for 8 hours a day. She rings up items for the very same wealthy suburban housewives she used to consider her peers. She has to smile and bag their produce while they look at her with quiet, whispering pity. They are completely isolated. They have no money to hide behind. They have no golden child to boast about. They are living paycheck to paycheck, trapped in a miserable existence they built entirely with their own hands. I have not spoken a single word to them since that night at the rehearsal dinner. I have not answered an email. I have not read a letter. They are ghosts to me now. When you cross a certain line, when you choose to sell your own child out to protect a monster, you forfeit the right to ever be called a parent again. Looking back on everything I endured, I realized that the physical pain of the car crash was nothing compared to the psychological agony of being the family scapegoat. For years, I was conditioned to believe that my needs were secondary. I was taught that my role in the family was to sacrifice my own happiness, my own savings, and my own future to pave the way for my brother. When you grow up in a toxic environment, you absorb the poison so deeply that you start believing you deserve it. You start believing that you are difficult, that you are a burden, that you are fundamentally broken. But I am speaking to you now, not as a victim, but as a survivor who crawled out of the dark. I want to tell you the absolute truth about toxic family dynamics. Society constantly pushes the narrative that family is everything. We are told to forgive and forget. We are told that blood is thicker than water and that you must always stand by your relatives, no matter what they do to you. That is a dangerous, manipulative lie. Blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you. Blood does not give anyone the right to exploit your kindness, drain your resources, or gaslight you into believing you are crazy. Blood does not give anyone the right to discard you when you become inconvenient or when you stop serving their selfish purposes. Love is not supposed to be a transaction where you constantly pay the price while someone else reaps the rewards. If you are trapped in a family that uses you as a shield for their golden child or a dumping ground for their insecurities, you need to know that their treatment of you is a reflection of their own brokenness, not your value. You are not responsible for carrying the weight of their mistakes. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. True strength is not enduring endless suffering in the name of family loyalty. True strength is looking at the people who are supposed to protect you, realizing they are the ones holding the knife and having the absolute courage to walk away. It is terrifying to cut ties with the only family you have ever known. It feels like stepping off a cliff into total darkness. But I promise you that the darkness is temporary. When you finally release the burden of trying to earn love from people who are incapable of giving it, you create the space to find the people who will value you exactly as you are. I lost my ability to walk normally. I lost my parents and my brother, but I gained my entire soul. I gained a life built on profound honesty and fierce independence. I gained a family of friends and colleagues who see me, respect me, and choose me every single day. I am no longer the sick daughter. I am no longer the bitter, jealous sister in a wheelchair. I am a successful business owner. I am a woman who fought a corrupt system and won. I am whole. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, or if this story gave you the courage to set your own boundaries, please hit that like button and subscribe. I want to hear from you. What state or country are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. Remember, you deserve to be chosen first. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story.